The night Emma Reyes walked away from the only place she had ever called home, the temperature in South Dakota had already dropped to 12 degrees below zero. She wore a thin jacket, the kind that looks warm in a store window but fails completely when the wind cuts across the open plains. Her left eye was swollen shut. A bruise the color of a thundercloud had spread from her cheekbone all the way to her jaw. She carried a single plastic bag with 2 changes of clothes, a half-eaten granola bar, and a photograph of her mother who had died 3 years earlier. She was 23 years old, 5 months pregnant, and completely alone. She had met Derek when she was 19, fresh out of a foster care system that had never once made her feel wanted. He was older, confident, full of easy smiles and big promises. He told her she was beautiful. He told her she was smart. He told her she deserved better than the string of group homes and shared bedrooms she had grown up in. For a while, she believed him. For a while, things were almost good. But Derek had a darkness inside him that grew louder when he drank, and he drank more as the months turned into years. The first time he hit her, he cried afterward and told her it would never happen again. The second time, he blamed her. By the third year, the violence had become as ordinary as breakfast. The pregnancy had been unexpected, but Emma had felt something shift inside her the moment the test turned positive. She had looked at that tiny pink line and felt, for the first time in her life, that she had a reason bigger than herself to survive. She told herself she would leave. She made plans in her head at night while Derek slept beside her. She thought about where she would go, how she would manage, what kind of life she could build. But every morning, fear swallowed the plans whole. She had no money of her own. No family. No friends Derek had not slowly pushed away. She had no ID because he kept it locked in a drawer. She had nothing except the hope that lived quietly inside her, growing alongside the baby she was already beginning to love. The night she finally left was not planned. Derek had come home furious about something that had nothing to do with her, as it often did, and the fight had turned violent faster than usual. Emma had grabbed the plastic bag she had secretly packed 2 weeks earlier and hidden behind the washing machine, and she had run. She had run through the back door, across the frozen yard, and out onto the highway that stretched long and dark in both directions. She did not look back. She was terrified he would follow. She was terrified he would not. She walked for 3 hours along the highway shoulder with trucks blasting past her in the dark, their lights sweeping over her for a second before swallowing her back into blackness. The cold was extraordinary. It was the kind of cold that feels personal, like the world itself is trying to push you back from where you came from. Her feet went numb first, then her hands, then the tip of her nose. She pressed one hand against her stomach as she walked, not for warmth exactly, but for something else. Connection. Reassurance. A promise she was making to someone who could not yet hear her. She reached the small town of Pine Ridge just before midnight. The gas station on the edge of town was the only thing still lit. She stepped inside, and the cashier, a teenager with headphones around his neck, looked at her face and then looked quickly away. She used the bathroom, ran warm water over her hands until they stopped aching, and stared at herself in the mirror for a long time. The woman looking back at her was barely recognizable. But her eyes were still hers. Still burning with something that had not yet been put out. She asked the cashier if there was a shelter anywhere nearby. He shrugged and handed her a folded piece of paper from under the counter, the kind with tear-off phone numbers at the bottom. All the numbers had already been torn away. She bought the cheapest thing in the store with the crumpled $12 she found at the bottom of her plastic bag, a small bag of crackers, and sat down on the curb outside to eat them. The stars above Pine Ridge were impossibly bright, the kind you only see in places far from city lights. She looked up at them and felt something strange and quiet move through her. It was not peace exactly. It was more like the stubborn refusal to give up. She did not know where she was going. She did not know how she would survive the night. But she kept breathing. And for now, that was enough. Emma spent the first 3 nights of her new life in the back seat of an unlocked pickup truck she found parked behind the gas station. She was not proud of it. She was not ashamed of it either. Survival has a way of making you very practical very quickly. During the day she walked through Pine Ridge, which was small enough to cross on foot in 20 minutes, asking at churches and community centers if there was anywhere she could stay. Most people were kind in the way that people sometimes are when they cannot actually help. They smiled sympathetically, gave her directions to services that turned out to be closed or overbooked, and sent her on her way with cups of hot coffee that she accepted gratefully and drank in tiny sips to make them last. On the 4th day, a woman named Ruth, who ran a small food pantry out of a church basement, sat down across from Emma and looked at her with the kind of directness that had no cruelty in it. Ruth was in her 60s, with short gray hair and the steady hands of someone who had spent decades doing practical work for people in hard situations. She asked Emma 3 questions. Where are you from? Where are you going? Do you need help? Emma answered honestly. Nowhere. Nowhere. Yes. Ruth nodded once, as if the answers confirmed something she had already suspected. Then she picked up the phone and made 2 calls. The first call was to a domestic violence hotline, which had a waiting list for shelter space of 4 to 6 weeks. The second call was to someone whose name Emma did not catch, but the conversation was short and involved a lot of nodding from Ruth and a few quiet words that Emma could not quite hear from across the room. When Ruth hung up, she refilled Emma's coffee cup and said, simply, "There is a place about 40 miles from here. On the reservation. They take people in. Good people run it." She wrote an address on a piece of paper and slid it across the table. "I cannot take you myself, but there is a man named George who drives out that way on Thursdays. That is tomorrow. Be here at 7 in the morning." Emma was there at 6:30. George turned out to be a quiet man in his 70s who drove a battered red truck with a cracked dashboard and a dream catcher hanging from the mirror. He did not ask her any questions during the 40-mile drive. He played low country music on a crackling radio and pointed out landmarks occasionally, a hill where eagles nested in spring, a creek that flooded every year and surprised people who forgot to be careful. Emma watched the landscape through the window and felt something she could not name. The land here was vast and strange to her city-shaped eyes. The sky was wider than seemed possible. Everything felt old, as if the land itself remembered things that human memory had long forgotten. The camp emerged slowly from the landscape, as if it had grown there rather than been built. There were a cluster of simple structures, some traditional, some modern, arranged in a careful circle around a central open space where a fire burned steadily despite the wind. There were people moving around it, some in conversation, some working quietly at tasks Emma could not identify from the truck. Children played at the edges of the firelight. Smoke rose in a thin gray line and dissolved into the enormous sky. Emma felt her chest tighten in a way that was not fear. It was something older and harder to explain. George pulled up to the edge of the camp and stopped the truck. He pointed to the largest structure, a long low building with a painted mural across its front wall, a horse running through colored light, its mane streaming behind it. "Go to that building," he said. "Ask for Chief Joseph Runs with Thunder. Tell him Ruth sent you." He did not wait for her to respond. He simply nodded once in the way that seemed to be the local language for "I believe you will be all right," and then he drove back the way they had come. Emma stood at the edge of the camp with her plastic bag in one hand and her heart beating very fast. A few people noticed her and nodded. A young woman with a baby on her hips smiled in her direction. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the grass with a sound like slow breathing. Emma straightened her back, a habit she had developed long ago to make herself look less afraid than she felt, and walked toward the painted building and the door that stood open, as if it had been waiting for her. Chief Joseph Runs with Thunder was not what Emma had expected, though she would have struggled to explain exactly what she had expected. He was perhaps 60 years old, with a broad face deeply lined by weather and time, silver hair pulled back simply, and eyes that were dark and very calm. He was sitting at a plain wooden table when she came through the door, reading something in a spiral notebook, and he looked up at her without surprise, as if visitors in this condition, bruised, frightened, carrying everything they owned in a plastic bag, were not unusual, which, she would later learn, they were not. He set down the notebook and gestured to the chair across from him. Emma Saturday. He did not ask her what happened to her face. He did not ask her how far along she was. He looked at her for a moment with those steady dark eyes and then said, "You have been carrying something very heavy for a long time." It was not a question. It was the kind of statement that a person makes when they have seen enough of the world to recognize the particular posture of someone who has been surviving rather than living. Emma had not cried since she left Derek's house. She had been too focused on the practical business of staying alive and warm. But something about those words, so direct and so gentle at the same time, cracked something open in her chest. She pressed her lips together and breathed slowly until the moment passed. Joseph, as he told her to call him, explained the camp in simple, unhurried terms. It had begun 8 years earlier as a gathering place for ceremony and cultural practice, rooted in Lakota tradition. Over time, as word spread and need grew, it had expanded. They took in people who had nowhere else to go. Women escaping violence. Veterans who could not find peace in the world they had returned to. Young people disconnected from their heritage and from themselves. The rules of the camp were few but serious: no alcohol or drugs, no violence in any form, participation in community life, and respect, for the land, for each other, for the traditions that held the place together. Emma listened carefully. She had lived in enough places with unspoken rules that turned out to be traps that she had learned to pay close attention to what people told her up front. But there was nothing here that felt like a trap. There was no transaction being proposed. Joseph was not asking anything of her except presence and honesty. He asked where she had come from. She told him, briefly. He asked if she was safe, meaning whether Derek knew where she was. She said no. He nodded. He asked about the baby, whether she had received prenatal care. She shook her head. He wrote something in his notebook. He showed her to a small room in the women's building that had a narrow bed with clean blankets, a wooden dresser, a small window that looked out toward the fire circle, and a hook on the door where she could hang her jacket. It was the simplest room she had ever stood in. It was also the safest space she had occupied in years. She set her plastic bag on the dresser and sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window at the fire. A woman Emma had not yet met came to the door and introduced herself as Mary, who managed the women's quarters. She had a warm face and the kind of no-nonsense efficiency that Emma recognized from the best caseworkers she had encountered in the foster system, people who showed their care through action rather than sentiment. Mary brought her towels, a bar of soap, a bowl of warm soup, and a schedule of the next day's activities. That first night, Emma lay in the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the camp settling around her. Voices speaking quietly in Lakota drifted through the thin walls. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing a drum softly, the beat slow and steady as a heartbeat. The fire outside painted moving orange light through the window onto the ceiling above her. Her hand rested on her stomach. The baby moved. It was the first time she had felt movement she could truly feel, a small, unmistakable flutter, like a fish turning in still water. She caught her breath. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel entirely alone. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Emma had ever experienced. Life at the camp moved according to rhythms she did not immediately understand but quickly came to feel. Mornings began early, before sunrise, with a gathering at the fire circle that was part prayer, part greeting, part quiet acknowledgement that another day had arrived and that there were obligations to it. Emma stood at the edge of these gatherings at first, uncertain whether she belonged there. Joseph noticed. One morning he walked over to stand beside her and said, simply, "You do not have to understand something to be a part of it. You just have to show up." She showed up every morning after that. The camp ran on community labor. Everyone contributed according to their ability. Emma, in her second trimester and still regaining physical strength, was assigned to the kitchen initially, which suited her because it was warm and the work was concrete and there was always something useful to do. She chopped vegetables, washed dishes, stirred enormous pots of stew, and listened to the conversations that flowed around her in a mixture of English and Lakota. The women she worked beside were from different backgrounds and different stories, but they shared a quality she found herself drawn to, a kind of grounded directness, an absence of pretense. They did not ask about her bruises directly. They also did not pretend they were not there. They simply treated her with the steady, matter-of-fact respect of people who understood that dignity was not conditional. Joseph made time for her twice a week in something he called talking circles, which were not therapy exactly, though they functioned something like it. They sat across from each other or sometimes walked the perimeter of the camp while they talked, and Joseph guided the conversations with questions that were simple on the surface and surprisingly deep when she turned them over in her mind later. He asked about her childhood. He asked what she had loved as a small girl, before the world had gotten its hands on her. He asked what she imagined for her baby. He did not tell her what to feel or what to do. He listened in a way that she had rarely experienced, completely, without preparing his next statement while she was still speaking. He told her about Lakota philosophy in the same unhurried way he did everything. He spoke about mitikuya oyazain, the concept that all things are related, that every person, animal, plant, and element of the earth is connected in a living web that has no real edges. He told her that suffering was real and should not be minimized, but that suffering without meaning was the most difficult kind, and that part of the work of healing was finding the thread that connected pain to something larger than itself. He told her that in Lakota tradition, a person who had survived great difficulty was not considered damaged. They were considered someone who had been to a hard place and come back carrying knowledge that others did not have. That knowledge was a responsibility. Emma did not transform overnight. No one does, regardless of what dramatic stories suggest. She had nightmares about Derek that left her sitting upright in the dark, heart pounding. There were days when the depression that had followed her for years pressed down so heavily that getting up from the bed felt like an act of tremendous will. There were moments of sharp, irrational anger at everything and everyone around her, which she had to learn to hold and examine rather than discharge blindly. These things were not signs of failure. Mary told her that. Joseph told her that. The women in the kitchen told her that by the simple act of continuing to include her in the work and conversation regardless of what kind of day she was having. Her prenatal appointments were arranged by Joseph through a network of connections that she gradually came to understand was large and carefully maintained. Doctors, social workers, lawyers, educators, all connected to the camp in ways that had been built over years. A doctor named Dr. Chen drove out from Rapid City twice a month. She told Emma the baby was healthy. She told Emma she needed more iron and more sleep. She asked no unnecessary questions and answered all of Emma's questions with the kind of patience that Emma had not previously associated with medical appointments. Emma began to understand that the camp was not just a refuge. It was a system. It was a community with deep roots and long arms, built specifically to hold people who had run out of other options. She was not a guest being tolerated. She was a person being held. Clara was born on a Wednesday morning in March, when the first real suggestion of spring had begun to soften the edges of the South Dakota winter. She came quickly and without complication, attended by a midwife named Sandra who had delivered more than 200 babies at or near the camp and who moved through the process with the confident calm of someone who trusted both the work and the woman doing it. Mary held Emma's hand. 2 other women from the camp sat in the corner of the room, not doing anything in particular except being there, which turned out to be everything. Joseph waited outside. When it was over and Sandra placed Clara on Emma's chest, small, furious, impossibly warm, Emma looked down at her daughter and felt something move through her that she had no adequate words for. It was not just love, though it was that. It was recognition. As if she had always known this person and had simply been waiting for her to arrive. Joseph came in a few minutes later and stood at the edge of the room with his hat in his hands and looked at them both with an expression that was very quiet and very full. He said something in Lakota that Sandra translated softly, "She comes to a people who will remember her." Emma did not fully understand it then. She would spend years turning it over. But in the moment, lying in that simple bed with her daughter warm against her skin and the light coming through the window at an angle that made everything look briefly golden, it felt exactly right. The months after Clara's birth were the hardest and the best Emma had ever lived. The exhaustion of new motherhood was real and relentless. The weight of her past did not disappear because her future had changed shape. She still had legal matters to navigate, an order of protection against Derek, which Joseph's network helped her file, the slow and difficult process of obtaining replacement identification documents, the question of what came next and where and how. These things were not small. They required sustained effort and patience and the willingness to ask for help repeatedly, which was something Emma had always found painfully difficult and was slowly, stubbornly learning. But she was not doing it alone. That was the difference. That was the thing she had not known was possible. She had grown up believing, in the wordless way that children absorb the lessons of their circumstances, that she was fundamentally on her own in the world. That other people's help always came with costs she could not afford. That the only reliable thing was her own small, fierce self. The camp had not simply given her shelter. It had given her a different understanding of what people could be to each other. She had watched Joseph mediate a conflict between 2 camp residents with such skill and patience that both people left the circle looking lighter than when they had entered it. She had watched Mary sit with a teenage boy who was crying and did not want to talk, simply sitting beside him in silence until he was ready. She had watched the older women teach the younger ones traditional beadwork, passing knowledge hand to hand across generations, and understood that this too was a form of survival. Joseph began teaching her. Not formally, not in a classroom, that would come later, when she enrolled in a community college program 18 months after Clara was born. But informally, in the way he taught everyone who stayed long enough to pay attention. Through stories, through questions, through the daily practice of living according to principles rather than fear. He taught her that strength was not the absence of vulnerability but the decision to move forward in spite of it. He taught her that asking for help was not weakness but a form of trust, and that trust was the foundation on which all real community was built. He taught her that she had value not despite what she had survived but partly because of it, because she now understood things about human pain and human endurance that could not be taught from the outside. On Clara's first birthday, the camp held a small ceremony. It was not elaborate, but it was deliberate and it was beautiful. There was food and fire and music and the particular quality of joy that comes from a community that has chosen to mark time together. Joseph gave Clara a Lakota name in the ceremony, a name that translated roughly as "she who returns light," and Emma stood there in the firelight with her daughter on her hip and looked around at the faces she had come to know, Mary, Sandra, George the driver, Ruth from the pantry 40 miles away who had made the drive to be there, and felt something she had not felt since she was a very small child, before the world had shown her its hardest face. She felt held. She felt known. She felt, with a certainty that lived in her body rather than her mind, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because the journey had been easy or the destination perfect, but because she had walked every step of it herself, and she had not walked it alone, and the woman standing here now, strong, clear-eyed, holding her daughter in the orange light of a fire that had been burning for years before she arrived and would go on burning long after, was the truest version of herself she had ever met.